on YouTube. Is that correct? So everybody who might be at home gets to watch this. But we are very pleased to have with us tonight Clarion, the lead consultant on the zoning ordinance rewrite, and Fred Richardson, who I'm going to introduce here, is going to talk to you all a little bit about what they're going to be doing over the next little bit of time as they rewrite our zoning ordinance. So with that.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, good. I want to make sure. I am Craig Richardson. I'm a director with Clarion Associates. It's a pleasure for us to be here tonight. Joining me are a couple of colleagues with our firm, Jeff Green, who is going to actually assist with the presentation. Gordy Moore, who is on the front row here. We also have a large consulting team for this project. It's challenging. It requires expertise in a number of areas, and we have two of the other team members here, Anthony Jones and Joel Corner with Cypress. In terms of where we're going to go tonight, in terms of this kickoff meeting on the zoning code update, I'm going to just take a few minutes and introduce the team. I said we have a pretty large team, but I will give you some brief information about each of the team members. Then Jeff is going to cover the work program and schedule. In other words, a zoning code update, a comprehensive zoning code update, which we are embarking on, is a big challenge. Your current regulations are, numerous pages. You also have your your subdivision. It's usually a 2 to 2.5, 3-year process, but we will tell you how we, based upon the experience that we have had, are proposing to move forward and get from where we are today, kicking this project off, to an adopted, updated zoning code that meets the goals that the community has for the project. One of the things that we like to do at the very beginning of the project is cast a very broad net in the community and get input from as many sources as we can on what they think the potential project goals should be. I say that in terms of casting the net in the community. In addition to that, you have a recently, in terms of looking at project goals, you have a recently adopted comprehensive plan. Obviously, there is specific policy direction about development goals in the plan, and obviously that will be a starting point for us. But also hearing from you, the public, is very important too. We're going to do that in a number of ways. We'll get input tonight. One of the things we will be doing after we cover some potential project goals that we have either gleaned from the plan, policy direction, other sources, is we're going to conduct a short survey. We're going to ask you some questions, so we would like to get your input. And then we would also we're going to open the floor to anyone who would like to add additional input to the process. So that's where we're going with the project. In terms of the team, Chris said that introduced me as a member of Clarion Associates. We are a mid-sized planning and growth management consulting firm. Our offices are in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We also have offices in Denver, Colorado. We've been in business now 30 years. We have successfully updated over 150, and I should say comprehensively updated over 150 code rewrites. It's more like 160 to 170 now. And up and down the East Coast, but also across the country, in the Midwest and in the Rocky Mountain states in particular. One of the projects that we recently completed was the update to the Norfolk, Virginia code. Norfolk is the East Coast community that is getting the greatest degree of sea level rise on the East Coast. They have actually significant flooding right now. And we were given the charge, and the plan directed them to retool their development code and to address this rising water environment. So there were a number of tools working with the staff that we included in that code. It was adopted it's about a year and a half ago. And we think it's a cutting edge code in terms of the issues, those types of issues that the code address. We've also done a lot of work in South Carolina. We fairly recently updated the Columbia code. We worked with a firm out of San Francisco and updated the Beaufort County code. We've updated the Rock Hill code. I was mentioned it's probably 12 years ago, we updated the Folly Beach code. But we've done a lot of work in the state of South Carolina. And then we've worked up and down the East Coast. I'm not going to list all these other projects, fairly recent projects where we've updated development codes, but we've done a lot of this type of work. One thing that we have learned on really important and big development code updates, it's important to have the professionals that and an interdisciplinary team that can address all the variety of issues that need to be addressed in the project. So we have six sub-consultants working with us, and they're going to play important roles in this project. Edward Coleman Partners is a form-based and coding and design firm that we've done a good bit of work with over the last 5 or 6 years. They're based in Miami. They also have a lot of experience in Charleston. They led the Plan West Ashley project, We Think Folly Road project. And they are going to work with us on any form-based coding or form-based code districts that will be leading the project and all design-related issues. We also have a second architectural firm, Union Studio. They are in Providence, Rhode Island, and they are going to focus and work with us on issues related to building design and construction to improve the resiliency of buildings, both in terms of redevelopment and redesign. They have there's one of the few firms, I think, in the country that has that type of actual experience where they've done that primarily to date in New England, but they will also be a supportive team member. In addition to this, we have White and Smith, a local Charleston firm, will work with us on development review procedures. They do a lot of development code work update. They actually handle the procedure. This updated procedures in Los Angeles code about 2 or 3 years ago. Blue Cypress, who I've introduced, Ansley and Joel, will work with us on facilitation and also on sustainability issues. Kittleson Associates and Bill, both engineering firms, will work with us on parking, ability, circulation. And then we have a firm, Horsley Witten, who has also worked in Charleston, Plan West Ashley and the West Ashley Master Plan on environmental, stormwater, green infrastructure related issues. So that's the team. It's large, but we think most of us have worked together in prior projects, and we'll be calling on the individual firms expertise in a particular area as needed. One thing I would like to also call your attention to, one thing we have learned in the code update projects that we have worked on is it's important to to have a project website. It is a great tool for getting the word out and for allowing for public input and public information to be made available to everyone in the community or anyone in the country, actually. So we have designed and made live today a project website. The website address, which is up on the screen, is newcharlestonstandards.com, NEWCHS standards.com. We actually capitalize CHS to at least sort of emphasize that, Charles is being abbreviated. You can use either capital letters or small letters to access the website. What do you have on
One
the
second, please, sir. I just got a text from a friend. He's trying to live stream this. He says that showing it hasn't started yet on YouTube. Is it showing that it's sent?
Says it's running. Yeah, it says it's running.
They go to just the regular City of Charleston public meetings.
City of Charleston public meeting?
Yeah, it'll be the one active.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the noise.
No problem. Just in terms of what's on the website, to sort of give you an idea, and I suggest for those of you interested to get I'd like to suggest everyone go to the website and get familiar with it. It won't take a long time. The kind of information we have general project information. We have information about the schedule that we're going to be covering tonight. We have a form that you can sign up, and you will be notified by email for any public meetings that we will have on this in this project. There's also a location where any work products that are being produced, which we'll talk about how we're going through this process, will be on the website. We've also created have a section that has links to all the background documents that are relevant, like the existing zoning code and plan, but there are a lot of other documents, a number of the studies that were made for the city related to the rising water environment conditions, but that's also on there. And then there will be a place where someone can go and provide input, comments about work products that are produced. So we encourage you to use the website. We encourage you to provide information to sign up for future meetings. I mentioned early on that we have a work program and schedule. We have found that it is very, very important to have a systematic process in a project like this, which is going to take a few years and deals with, a pretty complex document. We have 5 tasks. Jeff is actually going to step through those tasks for you.
This microphone, yes, this microphone works. Thank you, Greg. As Greg mentioned, we tried to set a very wide net at the beginning of this process to make sure that at the very outset, we hear from as many stakeholders as possible, as many interested people, as many residents and employees, residents of the city and people who work in the city, to make sure that they know that this project is going on, and so we can hear their concerns, things they think work well with current zoning regulations, as well as things they think don't work well. So we have at the very beginning, we're in task 1 here, which you can see over on the left. We're in the project initiation phase. So we're right in the middle of that. That involves a lot of document review. So we've already reviewed your entire zoning ordinance. We've reviewed your stormwater regulations. You all have had a lot of studies recently, along with the city plan, that talk about the impacts of sea level rise. So we've reviewed the land and water analysis. We've reviewed the Dutch dialogue. We've reviewed lots of documents that will feed into this process so that we can better understand the challenges that the city is facing and the revisions that might need to be made to the zoning code to address these challenges. Craig and Ensley and Joel and Gordy and I are here, as well as some other members of the team are here for 3 days. During that time, we're going to be meeting with a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of city staff who work day in and day out with the zoning code. We're meeting with community representatives. We're meeting with lots of different people. And as Craig pointed out, if you go to the website, there's also a survey that's open where we're hoping to get input from the entire community, anybody who wants to participate. We're meeting with the planning commission, so we'll be, if you look at the website, you'll see we have that meeting Wednesday night set up. We'll also be coming back for a second kickoff meeting, probably in a month and a half, and that agenda will be worked out in time. But really what we're doing is to understand exactly all the challenges that Charleston's facing and to learn from you all what are some of the priorities. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the priorities that we think we've identified. And again, at the end, we'll do a little bit of an interactive polling exercise to sort of see what everybody here and everybody on YouTube, what their priorities are. But that's what takes place in task 1. Task 2 is the code assessment. That's where we take everything that we're learning today, everything that we're learning in task 1, and preparing a document that looks at your code and makes recommendations for its improvements. So really, the code assessment has 2 parts. First is the diagnosis. We look at your current code and we identify areas where we think it could be improved, where there are ways to, either improve the substantive development standards that govern what new development and redevelopment looks like. We try to identify if there are areas where, the development review procedures could be made more efficient or more clear, so that people have more certainty of what type of development is going to take place. The second part of the code assessment is an annotated outline. So as part of the diagnosis, we identify areas where we think it falls short, and we also give recommendations for how we think the new code should look, how it should be organized, how the existing provisions in the code should be updated, the development standards of the other districts. And then the annotated outline takes it all together and says, if you accept the recommendations that we are providing, this is what your new zoning code will look like. So this will be will come out sometime in the fall. We're going to be coming back. There will be a version of this released for public consumption. We will invite everybody to read it, to comment on it. We'll be coming back out to Charleston to get your input, to see parts of the code assessment you agree with, parts that you disagree with. We'll also be talking with that about staff. Undoubtedly, we will make some recommendations that maybe miss the mark a little bit. And so there will be changes made after we come back and get input from you all. So that will be task 2. And it's an important task because, we're going to hear a lot from you. We don't want to jump right into drafting because, you all have we printed out the code. It's about 700 pages long. It's a very long code. And so, we don't want to start writing something without making sure that everybody's on the same page, that we agree on the roadmap. Code assessment is that roadmap. That will lead into task 3, that the drafting of the updated code. Again, a development code, zoning code is a very long document. And so what we have found that works really well is to break it up into sort of more bite-sized chunks. So we're proposing to do 3 different modules. Each module will consist of related parts of the development code. So for example, one of the modules might be the zoning districts. So those are the regulations that identify, the dimensional standards that apply to land, the types of setbacks, the maximum height, as well as use regulations. So those are the standards that say what uses are allowed to take place on a particular property. So that might be one module. We're going to work with staff to figure out exactly what that looks like. For each of these modules, there will be a draft that comes out to the public. We'll be coming back to get your input on each of these drafts. And we will take all of that input, and that will actually be incorporated into the code at a later phase of the project. So what we're going to do in task 3 is we draft the updated code, 3 modules. We come out to the public, we learn from staff, we learn from the public what changes need to be made, and what needs to be incorporated into the final version of the code. Craig mentioned that Dover Cole is a member of the team. They're experts in form-based coding. They work on Plan West Ashley, a recent plan in the city. And so, we'll be working with staff to identify areas of the city where it might be appropriate to develop a new form-based code. And that part of the Dover Cole's part of the project, developing that form-based code and developing the regulations that underlie will also take place during task 3, and that will possibly include charrettes, which are multi-day sort of events to help design what the form-based code looks like. So after we do those 3 modules, and we incorporate the revisions that we hear from you all, we have a draft code. But we have found that it's really important to take that new code and say, okay, if we apply it, if it were in effect in the city, would it do what we think it's going to do? So for task 4, which is testing the updated code, we will test 5 development sites under the updated code. We'll work with staff to figure out where those sites are, what type of development is being tested. Often it's some residential, some mixed use, some sort of commercial use. And we look at these sites under 2 different sets of regulations. We look under the current regulations, and we look under the proposed updated regulations. And so we see the difference the new code will make. And we also sometimes identify places where we fall a little bit short of our goals. And this helps identify areas where it's important that we, modify the revised code so that we can better make sure that we achieve the goals that we've identified in task 1. Again, at the end of that, after we do the testing, we'll come back for some more meetings. As Craig mentioned, public involvement is a key element of this project, and there will be public involvement, multiple milestones. And so we will present the results of the testing and learn from you all what you think about how the revised code is performed. And then finally, task 5, we take the draft code that we developed in task 3, along with the revisions that we get from the public meetings, any revisions that come out of the testing. We prepare a public hearing draft of the updated code, and that's ready to go to your city council and the planning commission for consideration and adoption.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So that is basically the process that we're going to be using from getting where we are now, starting this project, to an adopted, updated code that is consistent and addresses the goals for the project the city has laid out for us. What I would like to do now is we would like to turn to this issue of goal setting. As Jeff said, and I mentioned at the beginning, we do want to get your input on goals. One of the things that we have found to be very helpful in these kickoff meetings and early in the process when we start talking about what is it we need to achieve when we update this 700-page development code, is to at least to engage you and to sort of get you thinking about what's important. As we outline maybe 6, 7, 8 potential project goals, I want to be very clear that the goals that I'm going to talk about before we start the survey are not the ultimately goals of the project. They could be if we get positive input from the community, from your elected officials, your planning commission, your staff, that they are important. Clearly, the first one that I'm going to talk about is clearly directed in the policy direction of the plan. I want to mention one thing. One of the things that we will do in this assessment, in this next stage that Jeff talks about, is let's say that this goal on the slide right now, developing an elevation-based code that addresses rising water issues and incorporates sustainable development practices, is a goal that we need to address in this code update. In this assessment, we will talk about that, identify where that policy direction came from, and then we'll look at what your existing regulations do. And then based upon our experience and best practices nationally, we will make recommendations on how we would do it in this update. And then in the outline, we would in the outline show how we would do the regulations. So we would do that with each of the goals that the community ultimately identifies. But one of the clear directions of the plan, it was in the RFP that we responded to, was developing an elevation-based code. Another really addressing this water rising environment in the community. There are a number of ways to do it from the experience that we have had, particularly in Norfolk. And in land use regulations, one is restricting or placing limitations on development in the most vulnerable areas of the community. That's both new development and in terms of rules governing how redevelopment in this area would occur when property is damaged from these constant flooding or this rising water environment. Another potential way to address it would be to encourage, either incentivize or modify regulations to allow for much higher density development on higher ground. In other words, places where the elevations are higher and the potential for flooding is much less. Another approach is to restore and mitigate the natural system in the community, either by adding flexibility to your regulations to allow for that, and also through incentives, so incentivizing development that does that restores certain wetland environments or does things like that. Another thing, and this is a fairly big issue in Norfolk, was improving the city's ability to absorb shocks from flooding and severe storms. And what I mean by that is establishing some rules about locating where essential facilities in the future will be located. So that, when there is flooding that occurs, that it can be, schools will remain open, or pharmacies will remain open, new pharmacies that are built will remain open. Things of how electrical substations are located. So those are the kinds of issues that is certainly one goal. There are other types of considerations. I talked about Union Studio, but building design and elevation requirements, the new development as well as redevelopment is another way to do this. Another policy direction in the plan was to evaluate and incorporate equity concepts in the code. Generally, what that means, and certainly we will have to provide detail and evaluation on this issue in this process, is basically try to ensure that there's a level playing field, that the zoning ordinance establishes a level playing field for the all elements of the community, underrepresented members of the community, as well as others. And where there are substantive rules that might have an inequitable impact in terms of housing affordability, for example, that those types of issues are addressed, or where there is discretionary review processes that could result in one portion part of the community being not treated equally, that needs to be looked at, or other types of zoning standards. Another issue, and we talked about it in the overview of the actual drafting, is where appropriate, establish context-sensitive regulations or form-based districts. In other words, that making certain that the development regulations in distinctive areas of the town support those development patterns, neighborhood amenities, and general form, if that's what the community desires. Another is, and I think an important issue that is also part of your plan is providing and incentivizing affordable housing. Things like, and this is a problem nationwide today, quite frankly. And it's not a problem that is easily addressed for a variety of reasons. One thing is providing a diversity of housing options in a number of districts, realistic housing options. Whether it's duplex, triplex, mansion, apartments, other types of municipal housing. In the Columbia Code, we created a development option for cottage homes, which are smaller homes that are actually provide real alternatives for sort of folks that are downsizing or want to live in smaller homes. In infill situations, allowing for higher density multifamily and townhomes in appropriate locations in the community. And then incentivizing those, even creating stronger incentives for those who want to provide affordable workforce housing opportunities in the community. So we, at least the plan identifies that as a very important goal. Another, based on our review of the existing code, and I think probably one of the goals in just about every code update that we have done is to make the document more user-friendly. You have a code that hasn't been comprehensively updated over 50 years. There are many opportunities to make it more understandable, more intuitive, more logical. And certainly we would suggest that the community do that in this code update. This can be done in a lot of ways. Adding graphics, illustrations, and summary tables is a really good way to do it. Deleting obsolete and unused provisions, incorporating a consistent zoning district format. For example, at least on this slide on the far right is an example of a zoning district format that we used recently in several of our codes, where we integrate photographs, three-dimensional drawings, tables, and as you can see, not a lot of text to establish the rules for the zoning district in 2 pages. At the top of that example is the purpose statement. There are aerials and photographs below that showing the development patterns that are basically that will be followed at the dimensional standards that comply with the district. A reference to a use table where someone can identify what uses are allowed, what uses are special exception or condition. And then the dimensional standards table. And that is followed by, on the other side of the page, a three-dimensional drawing, which actually shows the application of the dimensional requirements to the code. And, in some of the districts that would have additional performance standards or requirements, this district would be a bit longer, but, we find it's very important to be consistent in terms of layout, but also to integrate, to make the document more user-friendly is to integrate photographs, aerials, three-dimensional drawings, to convey zoning concepts. So that's certainly something that we can do in making the code document more user friendly. Other things we can do is make the organization more logical in terms of integrating what I think are the three basic core elements of the development code: the procedures, the zoning districts and uses, and the development standards. When I say development standards, I mean parking, landscaping, design form standards, tree protection, those sort of things. So addressing inconsistent language, addressing conflicting language, using more precise language and measurable standards using plain English, and updating definitions, modernizing definitions. These are all things that can be done. And then finally, in terms of user friendliness, we would suggest that we conduct a review of your existing procedures to see if there are ways that we can make them more efficient, and basically to integrate procedures in one chapter of your code document. With that, I'm actually going to, there are a few other goals we have before we start the survey, and I'm going to turn those over to Jeff. And then Jeff's going to answer and conduct the survey.
So one of the ways to make a document easier to use is to collect the zone districts and use regulations together in separate but related sections to make it a little more clear what the different zone districts are, what the different regulations are, and what uses are allowed in each district. A couple slides earlier, Craig showed you the example of a zone district page from one of the other codes that we prepared. That's one of the key ways to make it a little easier to understand the zoning district and regulations. But we'll also take a closer look. You all have a lot of zoning districts. We're going to take a look and see where there are opportunities for us to modernize them, restructure them, maybe streamline them. See if there are different zoning districts that could be combined in ways to make the code a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to understand. We'll identify any districts that are unused, any districts that are duplicative, and remove those. Make sure that the Charleston City Plan, which really has a lot of detail about the city's priorities, make sure that the zoning districts fully support the type of development that it calls for. One thing we've learned from our just talking with staff is that there's a lot of planned unit development that takes place in Charleston. Some of that may be because there are not zoning districts that fully support the type of development that the city wants, that the market wants to provide. And so that's something that we're going to look at the types of PUDs that are being developed. Are there elements of those that can be pulled into different zoning districts so that if there are new developments, whether they're infill developments, whether they're new residential subdivisions, whether they can fit under a general zoning district instead of a specific PUD. And we will also go through all of the uses and use regulations, make sure the definitions are precise and clear, and also identify places where there are new types of uses that the current code did not anticipate, does not include, that should be incorporated into the new code. Finally, just very briefly, we're going to talk about the development standards. So those are the standards such as landscaping requirements, parking requirements, and talk about ways that some of the changes we might make there. One thing I'll point out is that we will look at all of these development standards through sort of two separate lenses. First, the sustainability and rising water levels lens that we talked about earlier, as well as equity, to make sure that these standards aren't working at cross purposes. Just one small example, many development codes have minimum parking requirements, which is fine. But if those minimum parking requirements are too high, one issue you get is that you have too much space, generally impervious surface like concrete and asphalt, that's devoted to parking that's not necessary, may not be used. So that may not be fully supportive of the city's efforts to address the fact that water levels are rising, and that we need to figure out ways to reduce, if not increase, impervious surface. So that's something we'll be thinking about as we review all of these development plans. Speaking of parking, we'll go through, make sure the parking requirements are appropriate, and move away from one size fits all. Many development codes, many modern development codes have different types of parking requirements for different parts of the community where there might be different types of travel demand, walking versus driving, or bicycling. It might be possible, in fact, to eliminate minimum parking requirements in certain areas of the city. And we'll also update site and building design standards to prioritize bicycle and pedestrian access as well. Exterior lighting standards. We think there might be opportunities to add some general exterior lighting standards to improve sort of the comfort walking around at night and also help protect the night sky. And also neighborhood compatibility standards. So these are the types of standards that make sure that if there is commercial development that goes near existing single family development, then it's designed in such a way to mitigate any negative impacts. So for example, if it's a commercial development that has a drive-through, make sure the drive-through is as far away from the residential development as possible. Make sure parking and the headlights from vehicles are not shining into the backyards, things like that. So we're at the stage, we're actually going to do a little bit of a polling exercise to sort of get your thoughts. And anybody who's in the audience here physically, anybody who's watching on YouTube, y'all can participate. So what I would ask you to do is get out your cell phone. In just a moment, I'll be giving you information about how to connect your cell phone to take the survey. So you're gonna, you'll see what happens. There's going to be slides up here, which will provide some polling questions, and you'll be able to answer them on your phone. And the phone will include the question as well as the different options. Once most people have made a response, we'll go ahead and share the results on the screen. To make sure everyone's comfortable with the technology, we'll start with 2 sample questions. There are 2 different types of questions that we'll be asking in this polling exercise. So we've got 2 very controversial questions that we'll want to get at the start. So a couple ways you can connect. You can go to that website. So that's menti, menti.com, and enter the code you see on your screen. That's 2637-6412. Also, we have this enormous screen, so it should work for you to take a photo with your phone of that QR code. And you can see by the bubbles down there, we've got a good number of people who've already connected. We'll just give it a moment. Oh, this isn't working. All right, we'll do this one. All right, how do we do that?
We're at 25.
All right. Anybody having issues connecting? Is it just not going to the website or?
It's asking you to create an account. That happened before. Are you able to try exiting the browser, and reopening the whole browser? That might work.
All right. That's awesome. Great. All right. Here's the first question. Well, this is the first of 2 types of questions. Let's see what your favorite college source is. I have a lot of love for Coastal Carolina.
University of Leicester.
This isn't working. All right, okay, so that's one type of question. So the other type, and you can see on your phone, there's a little slider. So for each of those questions, you can say whether you're not supportive, you're moderately supportive, or you're very supportive. And so you can see the numbers that you're seeing are sort of average. That's one of my coworkers' cats. She's very excited to have her cat on the All right, great. Okay, so there will be those two types of questions, the multiple choice, and then this question of whether you're not supportive, moderately supportive, or very supportive. All right, just a couple other introductory questions. Just want to sort of learn who's here. So if you can let us know whether you live in Charleston, work in Charleston, both, or either. Thank you all. And one more question, getting at the obviously rising water levels are a big issue. Just want to know if you live in or own property that's susceptible to flood. Great, thank you. All right, good job. All right. So we're going to ask you a few questions. Some of them are pretty similar to the project goals you saw. Some are a little bit different. And we really want to learn from you what types of goals you support, types of goals you don't support, and also whether you think certain goals are really important or not particularly important. So, and we're going to, unlike these earlier questions, we're just going to not show the results until a bunch of people have answered, just so that folks feel free to answer and aren't influenced. So, would you support these three general approaches of an elevation-based zone control? So the first is restricting development and redevelopment in the most vulnerable areas in the city. So generally those that are most likely to have sort of significant impacts from sea level rise and from increased king tides and other tides. Restoring and mitigating natural systems like wetland areas to better address rising water, and also encouraging and supporting development, since one idea might be to restrict development in low-lying areas, to encourage people want to live in Charleston, to encourage the development to take place in higher areas. All right, these are all, 3 is the highest, and 1 is the lowest. So obviously these are, you all seem pretty supportive of these ideas. All right. 3 more provisions for you to look at. Currently, most development in the city is required to be built, that's in a floodplain, needs to be built 2 feet above the base flood elevation. Want to know if you support changing that to 3 feet. And that just gives an additional margin of error and will help account for additional sea level rise over the coming decades. Strengthen development standards to require building expansions or remodels to increase resilience to rising water. Generally, development codes, there are different standards that apply to brand new development versus redevelopment. You may not be required to comply with as many of the requirements in the zoning code. So the question here is whether those should be strengthened so that redevelopment is required to sort of comply with additional standards relating to resilience. And finally, require critical facilities, so presidential needs, pharmacies, police, fire, hospitals, to be located outside of these areas that are most susceptible to flood. Right. A little bit less for the strengthening building expansions, building model, but still pretty high support for all of this. All right, 3 more provisions. One might be to require that, if somebody's coming in with development, you need to take a look at, one thing that we've learned from reading the land and water analysis is that the watersheds and the flood patterns in Charleston are really complex. Most areas have one watershed, you all have dozens. That makes it sort of very challenging when you look at an individual site to determine how rising water levels might affect it. So one option might be to require that the proposed development account for the sea level rise and decide, if in 20, 30 years, what are the impacts going to be? Is the development going to be flooding, frequently or not? Second one is about building back. So if a piece of property is damaged by flooding or damaged by a storm surge, to restrict the ability of folks to just sort of build that same type of development back, to require that any replacement development sort of meet the heightened standards relating to resilience of the resource. And finally, again, increasing development density intensity in areas of higher elevations that are less susceptible to flooding. Okay, interesting. Okay, we're getting to the end of these. Couple more provisions. So first, allowing sort of a little more flexibility of housing types in primarily single-family residential neighborhoods. This, allows sort of higher areas to better accommodate more people in a form that's more compatible with single-family neighborhoods versus larger apartment buildings. And it also may make housing a little more affordable by providing sort of smaller types of units that are attached, which generally at new construction are a little bit cheaper than new single family. And also to mitigate the impacts, I talked a little bit about this earlier, of commercial development or higher intensity development near single family neighborhood with neighborhood compatibility standards. Generally supportive, a little less supportive than some of the earlier recommendations. Okay, this is, we're going to ask you basically scale 1 to 5 from very important to not important, how important the following priorities are in the updated zone. Allowing higher density townhome and multifamily development in areas of the city less susceptible to flooding. Again, very similar question to what we asked earlier. We want to ask it sort of in a different way. Okay. Clearly a high priority. One thing we've heard about, Charleston is a pretty tough place to buy a house. It's pretty expensive. So whether the zoning code, whether it's important for the zoning code to include strong incentives for affordable and workforce housing. Again, very important. This is, we talked about user friendliness. I'm not sure how many of you are regular users of the code or read through it, understand what's happening in the neighborhood or for fun. But just want to know, maybe that's just me. But just want to know how important you think it is that we include these sort of user friendly elements. whether the development review procedure should be more streamlined and logical. Make sure there's more clarity about what standards apply, what requirements apply to the development. And also to make sure that sort of neighbors better understand the process for a development application if somebody is proposing new development. Tree protection standards. Charleston already has standards that protect general tree coverage as well as certain larger trees, grand and protected trees. Want to get your input as to whether you think those need to be strengthened or if they're stronger. Just a little more about distribution. On this. Strengthen, and you all have pretty new stormwater management standards. But there's always opportunities to strengthen them, to make the city more resilient to flooding. And so we want to learn from you how important it is that the new zoning code, the new ordinances include strengthened stormwater regulations, such as requiring that the development sort of reduce the amount of runoff for the first inch of rainfall in the site.
What if you think an inch isn't enough?
I would say, I would mark that as very important. And I would also, when you take the survey, I would also make that point as well. We need a lot of consistency in this. Finally, I believe this is the last question. Would you support the following priorities? So first, we talked about the off-street parking requirements. So want to get sort of your thoughts on whether you support updating them to align with what we call modern best practices. So that is improving the design, perhaps increasing opportunities for developments to reduce the amount of parking that they're required to provide if they can demonstrate they don't need all that parking, and improving the design of parking lots. And I guess that's the second one as well, broadening opportunities to reduce parking by such measures as off-site parking, allowing them to provide valet or Kinman parking, so you have a valet which would park them off-site in some other area, and things like that. Great. Yeah, so we will this presentation will be posted on the website and will be available for your whether you're watching here or online. And also, once again, there is the full survey. So we had one question from the audience about stormwater runoff. I encourage anybody who has further comments, please go to the website, take a survey. Yeah, we can put the survey results on the website.
So if anybody that's interested, I know you've seen these quickly, but if you want to go to the website in a few days, then we'll have you can take a look more closely at the results. So we've got some input tonight, and this is just the beginning of the process. I want to be very clear about that. We'll be taking your input on what's important in terms of what we need to address in this project over the next couple of months. And really, as we move through the project over the years, but we really encourage your input as early in the process as possible. So now what we would like to do is, if there are any specific questions that anyone has about the project or any specific goals that you would like to comment about that we should be addressing in this project, then we'd love to hear from you. Yes, sir.
First, so in Attleboro, there are already some placeholders. In other words, parking lots that have already been sold to developers or hotels, for instance. How are your analysis of the zoning that's going to be, overlaid on top of that existing, those sales work. Will you have the option of going in and say, look, even though these sites have already been sold as, for instance, hotels, that's not a good idea.
You're talking about they have been approved for
Right,
the use?
right. Or
Um,
any development that's already been approved in the city, how much flexibility do you have to approach, zoning board and say, look, these are approved, but it's really not a good idea if you expect to achieve these goals, whatever the end goal is.
Initially, one of the things we will do from the outset is in early, and usually it's always in the first article of the development codes we've been updating, is we will set down rules that address what the policy is going to be about, whether or not projects that have been approved will be grandfathered, or whether there's going to be another rule. That is a discussion we are going to have with your elected officials in terms of what policy direction they want. But with that said, clearly there are certain legal limitations too that we'll have to take into consideration.
So you might have to modify your plan. I mean, do you do it independently and then say, look, wait a minute, where is this going to fit in with what's already been, approved, or do you work, collectively while this is going on, collaboratively while it's going on?
You mean with members of the development community?
Yeah.
I mean, they are welcome to come and to talk to us or staff about particular issues. One of the things, one of the rules typically that we will include in this, we call them transitional provisions. In other words, rules of government that's already been approved or what's in the pipeline, in other words, being reviewed, at the time that the ordinance is adopted, is, we'll also have rules. And this has happened in some of the development code updates we've done, where a development applicant will actually like some of the either incentives that we've included in the new code, or some of the rules dealing with parking, or other development requirements that we have in the new code versus the old code. We clearly include provisions that allow someone to come in and reapply. In terms of how far we go in retroactively requiring it, that's, typically when someone has an approved project, they have an approved project. If they do want to come in and do a substantial modification, they're going to have to live under the new rules. We will have, clearly we will have incentives. And the other thing we'll do is, Jeff talked about modernizing some of your development standards. We're talking about, maybe making revisions to your zoning districts too. That all might affect, the kinds of issues you're talking about.
Well, obviously, the elephant in the room is union here. We're in the process, that whole plan coming together. And where is that going, the time frame of that as opposed to this zoning? Are you looking at what, I think it's 25, when this is going to be complete? 2025?
Well, it's going to be about a 2.5 year process. We would certainly have to, that's the plan right now. There have been code projects where we've worked where, while we're doing the comprehensive update, community might want to adopt, move forward with specific rules, dealing with parking or dealing with another issue, and we'll go ahead and move forward and work with staff and get those adopted. But typically, we're talking 2 to 3 years.
So you're taking the poll of what the residents here want, but things that have already been approved, they're not going to come back around and say, what, we've taken a poll, they don't want this hotel, although it's already been designated in the spot. What influence is that going to have on the development of the hotel, a hotel?
I'm not sure if I heard your question completely, but I think your question was, what is the influence of all the approved development going to have on future development in Charleston?
No, the poll that you said you're going to be putting out for all the residents here.
Poll?
Is that your poll?
Yeah.
Right. So you're gonna collect that information, and let's say that 80% of the residents in a certain area do not want a development, even though it's already been approved by the city. Is that going to have any influence then on potential for that development, or are we going to ignore that part of the poll?
We will evaluate it for sure. You're elected officials, I mean, set the policy, we can make recommendations to them and we will give them information about our experience, what other communities have done. But if what you happens, what you say happens, yeah, well, I mean, it's gonna be considered. I'm not gonna say what the result is going to be. But there are more ways to, there are more ways to skin the cat than just saying, we're going to change the rules and you're going to have to comply with a new set of standards. I mean, incentives, if they're powerful, they can work also. And there are other things. I mean, we were just, it's not an easy, not an easy issue to address, but there are ways to do it. Yes, sir.
It's great to see all of the resiliency and adaptation details, but I didn't see a whole lot about the sustainability development things you're looking at. Are you looking at things that symbolize green building practices, like carbon negative building materials, green roofs, solar infrastructure, etc.?
We absolutely can and will. We really sort of focus on this rising water issue, but I can tell you that over the last 7 or 8 years, it's interesting what's happened in our work over the last decade. 10 years ago, we're pretty involved in the development of the model sustainability development code that the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute developed, and now it's a standalone project. And we started recommending to communities a decade ago to try to address the sustainability issues. And most of the provisions we drafted and were adopted were incentives. We did 2 things. One is we removed obstacles so that development, that alternative energy developments would occur and you didn't have to go through a public hearing to do it, or remove other kind of obstacles, dimensional requirements. We also added incentives. In the last 5 years, we have begun including requirements in codes. I mean, we did a project in Florida, Central Florida, Maitland, and they have they have a point system, and every project has to, basically it's a sustainability point system, and each project has to achieve a certain number of points. There's a whole menu of things you could do to provide some flexibility. But yes, I mean, when we talk about that, and if we get direction to move in that, to do that, yes, we absolutely will in the project.
When you say direction, would that be direction from city council, direction from the community?
Well, it begins with the community, and then the planning commission. Ultimately, it's city council that makes the final decision and gives us direction. I mean, it won't be included in the code unless they adopt it. So they have to be part of the dialogue, an important part of the dialogue. Yes, ma'am. And I'll come over here. Yes, ma'am.
I just like to say I appreciate what feels like Dutch Dialogues 2.0. Because of the same sentiments. In that dialogue, nothing for us without us. So you've got an emphasis on looking at, are you causing additional harm in your equity component? So I really celebrate that. And I also really, really celebrate the fact that you're talking about restricted development in vulnerable areas. And I think the degree to which, as we do this process, we can agree on the things that are important, like with your surveys, that's a really powerful approach. And I just like to lift that up as being a really good step.
Thank you. Yes, sir, you had a
Yeah, so I thought the goals were good and made sense. Maybe I didn't recognize in the language, but will density, height, and the flora of multifamily units going up around town, the number of commercial hotel properties that seem to be popping up quite a bit, is that topic being addressed as well? Is that a goal in this initiative?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know if I completely understood, or not understood, but heard what you said, but basically you said,
Issues of density, like hotel development, commercial development, multifamily use that you now have quarters of streets lined by that. Is that issue of density being addressed with the rewrite?
it'll be evaluated, yeah, it'll be considered, yes, sir.
I didn't quite see it as stipulated as a goal.
Well, not-
This is my language.
It certainly wasn't today, but, you've raised it, but, typically in updating the development code.
It's an ongoing concern in the community, to anyone who picks up the paper or writes down the street. And there's constant debate about height requirements. It seems to me there's a good time to establish standards and put some of that debate. So.
Yes, sir.
Not really a question, just kind of a statement of my part to put out there, but I just think the number one issue should be housing costs, something that obviously impacts everybody. And unfortunately, it leads to a lot of the other harms that we see where basically it costs so much to find a place to live. People seek cheaper options out on the periphery in sprawling development. That leads to, of course, more impervious surfaces, more vehicular travel, type of things that lead to the harms related to the environment that we want to avoid. So I hope that density, far from being a problem, is actually a solution for us. That by prioritizing denser multifamily housing, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We can reduce the reduction of impervious surfaces, and seek these other goals that we're looking for. I'm excited that you have missing middle housing in here, the reduction of partner requirements. I hope is done citywide. Just unfortunate that process take 3 years when the project's going on right now.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
What sorts of constraints do the state law place upon?
Could you speak up?
Yes, what sort of constraints does state law place upon local zoning ordinances? And my second question is, what sort of incentives can you put in these ordinances to just sort of lead to restoration of natural systems?
Okay, your first question was, about authorization under the, state law. And there's a zoning enabling act in South Carolina. And there are several other laws that impact, are included, that authorize certain things in development. So, and relative to, we work in a lot of states. I think that actually the zoning enabling legislation in South Carolina is pretty good. It's certainly better than North Carolina, in my opinion. It's certainly broader than Virginia, in my opinion. So I think there's a solid authorization for the city to zone in most of the, and probably in the ways it wants to. And I'm sorry, if you could speak up a second question.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. What sort of incentives can you put in the ordinances to lead to restoration of natural systems for dealing with rising sea level, that sort of thing?
I think I mentioned a couple of things, and from my experience is number one is to provide more flexibility in your regulations to relocate, to move property, out of areas that would be to add additional protections, additional setbacks. The second is, the types of incentives. I mean, density is one, reduced parking requirement is another. We would have to look at the particular situation. It's gonna, if you are in a built environment, it becomes more difficult. You have a lot more flexibility with these types of regulations where you have larger parcels, to work with. So we'll just have to, we'll have to evaluate as we go through the process. Any other questions? We have a survey on the website. We'd love your input on that. We have a meeting with the planning commission on Wednesday. And that's open to the public. We look forward to your participation and input as we go through the process. So there are no other questions. Thank you, folks, for coming out. We look
Thank
forward to
Thank you.